Thank you all for joining us today. Hi, Beth. So the first panel, we'll be talking about rethinking globalization in the age of populism and crises. The global economic landscape is in flux. Policymakers and businesses are navigating geopolitical tensions, fragmentation, industrial policy. And one of the biggest changes in the latest chapter of globalization has been to trade and supply chains. Johanna, I'd love to start with you. From Russia's invasion of Ukraine to COVID to China's slowing economy, so much has happened at the same time, or at least has overlapped. What factors, from your perspective, have had the biggest impact on supply chains?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
I think so.
Yes? Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here today. As you said, the real shifts and the changes are happening so fast, one on top of the other. We think there are three main underlying drivers to these changes. Risks, costs, and technology. And let me go through them a little quickly. In the area of risks, companies, I think, are seeing, the effects of the pandemic, obviously, but followed by geopolitical tensions and armed conflicts to extreme weather events that we can't forget, that are really making businesses be more risk aware and therefore take measures in where they're going to locate their production. So many of them are concentrating on multi-sourcing and local suppliers, and maybe switching to just in case to buffer against disruptions. And let me give you an example. The 2023 State of Supplier Diversity Report reported that nearly 9 out of 10 U.S. companies were expecting to maintain or increase their support for supplier diversity in response to this type of risks. And then in the area of costs, we have seen some of the larger emerging economies, as they go up the value chain, obviously some of their costs are going up.
Right.
And this is obviously creating opportunities for other economies that still are not there. And then the new technologies are maybe what's going to be making the biggest changes. The deployment of AI is going to be changing, we think, some of the values that the economies bring to the table, and some opportunities for maybe the smaller developing countries where some of the labor force maybe don't have all the skills that you'd want in a supply chain, but through the deployment of AI, they can quickly catch up. But maybe not all companies are facing the same challenges.
Right.
Some had different strategies, like IKEA, that has, concentrated more regional supply chains. And so a lot of their sourcing is closer to the consumer. So in these facing fast-changing world, not everyone is going to respond the same way, is maybe my message. And so for some, it'll be more globalization. For some, it'll be regionalization. But there are opportunities in all the different models.
And we'll talk more about those opportunities. Rilla, you work in this space day in and out. The companies are your clients. They're people you're helping solve problems for. How has it been from their perspective? Where have supply chains had the biggest impact for them?
Yeah, I think I would like to start a bit by complimenting what Johanna said on the main drivers for the shifts. Just one perspective to add, in my opinion, is concentration risk, which I think is really right at the top. So since China's accession to World Trade Organization in 2001, it has made its way up in the manufacturing capabilities range to become one of the biggest and most comprehensive product manufacturer in the world. And we've seen them making their way through the economic diversification and being able to become the factory of the world, where we've seen a lot of companies leveraging, whether it's the low labor cost or the vast, I would say, industrial capabilities, the massive infrastructure, and clearly the great supply chains to use them, to use China to manufacture, whether it's components, whether it's finished goods. And we've seen Western companies more and more use China for that purpose. I think for me, that's why I see concentration risk as top on the agenda, leading to this fragmentation, if I may use this word, because inevitably it would create political anti-globalist, I would say, figures to object around the policy, that policy. And yes, clearly, we've seen clients in my domain, we've seen clients struggling during COVID-19, where it was a clear failure, where the world struggled to get access to medical equipments, to drugs, and to everything in supply chain. Too many was out of China. So there is clearly a resilience or a buzzword, I would say, resilience came up, and clearly a need to start thinking of reshoring and nearshoring as much as possible. And yes, we see it a lot. We see it a lot in this part of the world as well, not necessarily as an outcome of the situation, but more as a growth and diversification agenda.
As finding opportunities out of this, 3 years out of COVID. Faryal, you've been in the region for a long time. You've seen the changes. You've seen the activity in the last 5 years. What you do at DMCC is core to a lot of the trade hub that's being established. What has been, how have you seen these drivers change the way you have responded, or how DMCC, I should say, has responded in terms of bringing growth, responding to these this multifaceted challenge?
Absolutely. So just to, first of all, happy to be here today. Just to add to what Joanna and Rola both said, obviously post-COVID, we see kind of an accelerated shift that traders and markets are adopting in terms of diversification, in terms of looking for new partners, new alliances, new countries even to trade with. And the trade still remains resilient. It's very important for all of us to know that despite the geopolitical factors, despite the macroeconomics, trade in goods actually will grow by 2 to 3%. It's a small percentage, but there is still hope. And trade in digital services will significantly grow by 9%. And the two components that will very much support trade growth and resilience in the next decade is sustainability, for one, and adoption of digital services, in particularly AI. That is coming. And this is a wave that we are actually seeing on the ground today. The UAE today is one of the top 10 hubs when it comes to environmentally friendly technologies. We see the government launching the hydrogen strategy, the energy strategy, very much focusing on renewable energy and, again, environmental technologies. The UAE has committed, for example, to 1.4 million tons of clean hydrogen in the next 5 years, and triple the renewable energy in the next 7 years. And from a DMCC perspective, we see an increase of flow when it comes to digital services and digital trade. DMCC hosts the largest number of crypto ecosystem companies in the region, and that is growing day on day. We've also introduced the gaming sector. We've introduced the AI ecosystem recently because we see the demand in these sectors right now accelerating, specifically post-COVID, and similar to sustainability as well. Investment in green energy and renewable energy is something of focus, not just for governments and also for businesses today.
Beth, can you hear us? Fantastic.
Yes.
I want to come to you on economic fragmentation. The minister mentioned it. We've talked about it here. And one of the reasons, of course, several drivers, but one of them has been industrial policy, heavy-handed industrial policy from the West, and concentration risk in China, and multiple factors. as you think about it, what does it look like right now? And how much is it reality and how much is it theoretical? The theoretical risk of fragmentation versus things really fragmenting. And how do you come at it?
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry I can't be there with you. And I'm really glad that the frame for this conversation is so positive, that it's about a new chapter in trade, that it's about opportunities. One of the things we have to recognize is that the concentration risk, the geopolitical risk, the way we've gone about things has highlighted the risks associated with interdependence. We tend to only talk about the risks associated with fragmentation. There are also risks associated with interdependence. And that's what we experienced during the pandemic or during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We need to have diversification. So I want to make sure that when we talk about fragmentation, we think about it in the context perhaps as an offset to some of the risks that we saw with interdependence. We want to have a trading system that takes into account both of those sets of risks and to be sure that we're mindful of managing both of those sets of risks.
Joanna, you sit at the WTO, and one of the big things of the last, 30 years has been globalization, efficiencies. The pace of globalization has been beneficial to many countries and kind of many companies and so on. How does that square against the talk of economic fragmentation? Of course, there are opportunities, but how do we think about what that means in terms of costs, what that means in terms of, whether that's friction costs, whether that's setup costs? How are you thinking about it at the WTO?
So at the World Trade Organization, we have been undertaking research on the risks, obviously, and the opportunities, which we'll get to, I guess, in a moment. But thinking a little bit about the risks, our economists have undertaken a series of simulations of, what would happen if economic fragmentation came about in a very significant manner. And if the trading system was fragmented into two self-contained blocks, we do see that, global incomes would be greatly affected, especially for the smaller economies and the low-income households that could be mostly exposed. And one consequence would be that the benefits of specialization and technology spillovers, would fall, and that would lower the long-run level of real GDP by about 5% in the worst-case scenario. And then we would see additional costs coming up that have to do with, reduced economies of scale and, financial distress and transition costs. And not to mention that within these blocks, then maybe, some new trade barriers could come up. And then we have also been looking a little bit about the fragmentation in the area of data.
Right.
And what could happen if we had, not enough convergence in data flows, and we could see an additional 1% affectation to GDP. So we do see that there are important challenges, but this would be, the worst case scenarios if, economies were not able to navigate some of the most difficult aspects of it.
Rilla, where do you think the opportunities are? When we think about it from when you talk to your clients, what is the flip side of this? Where are the opportunities? Who are the emerging players?
I think this is a game where there are going to be losers and winners, clearly. And if I am to start with winners, maybe at a global level, I think we all see that the ASEAN market is gaining traction, and there's a lot of production moving to countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, given the proximity, the low labor cost proximity to China, clearly in that case. So if we think about those employees of those factories, this is clearly an opportunity for them. If we think about Apple employees functioning in plants in India, then this is an opportunity for them. If we think about nearshoring to US, And clearly with the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, there's a huge potential for Mexico as a country, and this is one of the winners out of the equation. There is a requirement as well to nearshore to Europe, and we've seen, and given I covered that region specifically, we've seen a lot happening in Central Eastern Europe, given most of the countries in Central Eastern Europe are part of the European Union, and again, proximity, low labor cost, and ability to adjust to any requirement and the potential of growth in the region is helping the region to really pick up and become one of the winners. I'm sure Chinese tech employees don't feel the same with all the tariffs and the sanctions coming their way. These are clearly losers in this scenario. Some industries need to be completely reshored, like when we think about the military space, AI and drone, with the US Science Act, a lot of that has moved already to Ohio and Texas, so there's a huge fabrication plants being set there. And coming to this world, clearly this is maybe the place to be. So if we think about the financiers and the lawyers in UAE and in Saudi, they are definitely on the advantage side of the equation. Middle East, specifically Saudi, UAE, are clearly on a growth trajectory. And there's all the Vision 2030 coming into play for most of GCC countries, where there is a need to diversify, to localize. And we've already seen a lot of manufacturing entities setting up business in this part of the world. If we are able to challenge the status quo and have a pro-business environment, I think this is a region that's going to benefit a lot from the situation. Again, if we think about demographics, I think India is another region that's going to cover a lot. It's young population with the ability to really adjust to all the requirements from a sales workforce perspective, consumption and growth, and so on. Okay. Not to leave Africa out of the equation, we've seen a lot of specific pockets in Africa gaining traction, whether it's Nigeria, Kenya, whether Morocco, which is becoming more prudent in automotive manufacturing, Egypt in textile. So definitely it's evolving everywhere. Now, how big is the loss? I think this is, or the gain, I think this is impossible really to quantify. I think when I was preparing for this session, I was trying to think what I'm going to say about that. And it's really very hard, because it's as if you're being asked to give a perspective on how much the Arab world would have been wealthy if the first great caliphate hasn't been really challenged by the Mongol Khans, or how Europe would be wealthy if the Roman Empire managed to persist the roots between East and West. The pie definitely is not going to grow. There are losses that's going to hit us, but it's very hard to quantify. And to be a bit positive, I think, as Beth had mentioned, maybe there are more opportunities than we anticipate.
Yeah. Faryal, before I come to you about the opportunities in the region, in the wider region, not just the UAE, Beth, I want to ask you, how do you see from the US perspective, as these different hubs are emerging, you're picking and choosing, you've got, there's a China relationship, and the US does not have, it is investing in supply chains, but it does not have huge supply chains and a huge network of suppliers. How do they balance, or how do you think about balancing the relationship in, say, the Middle East, where China is becoming more prevalent, but the US has also got very strong tech partnerships, and companies are trying to come here. OpenAI is trying to come and raise money here, and it is a ground for everyone. How do you think about it from the US perspective?
We want to think about diversification that supports a more resilient economy. And it does come back to the lessons learned from the pandemic. When we don't have access to masks, or to ventilators or protective equipment and our frontline workers are dying, that's where we come back to the concentration risk being something that we are obligated as a government to deal with. We want to make sure that in the way that we think about these issues, we're considering opportunities for all of our trading partners. One of the things we've done, and we do have a number of trade agreements with partners in the Middle East, we're thinking through what our historical practice has been with respect to free trade agreements, because those agreements were largely crafted, and the supply chain rules in those agreements were largely crafted during an age of just in time. And I think somebody was talking about now we're in an era that's more so just in case. We're trying to make sure that we think through these supply chain rules with our partners so that we are genuinely promoting diversification and resilience and not embedding mistakes of the past. I would point folks to a speech that Ambassador Tai gave a year ago at the Open Markets Institute on June 15th, where she talked about, could we build out a version of globalization that turns colonialism on its head, where everybody has the opportunity to participate in every step of the value chain? That's not the way we've thought about globalization in the past. Is that something that we can work towards together?
But will America be comfortable with that, with, China being in equal part in those supply chains, whether it's building out supply chains in Morocco or Mexico or elsewhere in the world?
I'm not sure it's going to be the most productive thing for us to reduce all of our relationships to the prism of the United States and the People's Republic of China. We want to look at our trading partners on their own merits, look at the opportunities that exist with our trading partners so that we can all participate in whatever the new opportunities are.
For y'all, just going back to what we were talking about, the Middle East emerging as, and specifically the Gulf emerging as a winner, it's hard to ignore obviously what's happening in the neighborhood. How do we balance, how does the Middle East or the Gulf balance, the conflict in the wider region, its own economic diversification plans, and then trying to become what it wants to become and maintaining partnerships?
Just to also add to what Beth said, I'll start with that. The US-China conflict or dynamic will actually have a great impact on the economic landscape moving forward, and especially with the US election coming up, whether this will create increased tariffs, increased restrictions, on China and others. That will actually push a lot of countries further down regionalization, bilateral agreements, and choosing alternative sources of production to the ones that they were reliant on up until today. And you could see, the minister said the UAE has already signed 20 comprehensive economic agreements already, 6 of which are in motion. For example, with India alone, when the CEPA was signed with the UAE in 2022, up until today, we see an increase of over $100 billion of trade with India, with an increase of 15%. So you can see the effects of these agreements coming in. And it's good also to note that countries such as the UAE as well as Singapore, with their more of neutral position, I can say, when it comes to the geopolitical scene, the infrastructure that they provide, the regulatory environment that they have, they will always act as facilitators and connectors between markets, whether it's, passing through to North America or to the ASEAN market or Asia market. And those will be critical to facilitate trade moving forward, looking at their positioning where they don't necessarily take sides, with winners or losers.
In that context, I guess, Joanna, when we think about if we reframe fragmentation as reglobalization, we've talked about opportunities, we've talked about kind of high-level opportunities. But does it, in a way, make international trade, the splitting up of international trade, whether it's all these bilateral agreements, whether it's all these various agreements, how does the WTO come in and look at this more holistically? Because it's no longer, the rules-based order of the last 20 years.
So at the World Trade Organization, we are putting a lot of emphasis on reglobalization, and it's looking at what is happening right now, seeing the risks that we talk about, but not forgetting that there are many opportunities for many more countries and many more communities within countries taking advantage of trade and it becoming a more inclusive trading system. Around 75% of world trade happens under WTO rules. So definitely they are the basis for many of these regional and then bilateral agreements that get built on top of that foundation. And so as many companies are navigating the new environment, we see that they are working in more resilience strategies, trying to see how to incorporate more suppliers, more partners. And at the World Trade Organization, we are working on a lot of these issues in tandem. So as Minister Al-Saoudi said, goods trade is very important, but services is also the future of trade. And at the Abu Dhabi Ministerial Conference came into effect some agreements on services domestic regulation to make doing business in the area of services much easier. So that's a step forward. We also had the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement that was adopted by 3/4 of the organization. And we're hoping that it's going to come into effect in the architecture of the WTO at some point. There's also a subset of members that are working on digital trade. They have signed on to a stabilized text on e-commerce. And so as these, things are happening and supply chains are changing, we're trying to see how the World Trade Organization can adapt. And it's not only the rulemaking function of the organization that's important, it's also a place where members come and dialogue and speak about these important issues and try to come to understandings. And so as we look at the organization and try to see where reform should come about, we should not only think about the negotiations and the rulemaking, but also think of it as a forum to come to understanding on important global issues like climate change and how trade can play a role in facilitating coming into the green economy.
Beth, I think you wanted to add something on that, on the WTO reforms.
I don't think the WTO gets enough credit for undertaking the reform project. And we look at some of the other Bretton Woods institutions. We see the WTO as very far ahead in embracing the conversation, understanding it's necessary. I agree with what Johanna has said about we underestimate the convening power of the WTO, the ability for members to come together and meet. I was in Abu Dhabi for the ministerial conference where we were able to have wonderful conversations about where we want to take the organization.
Priyal.
I commend the WTO as well. And with us saying that, for example, the move to digital or AI adoption is actually the way to go, there is still so much that needs to happen, for example, through the WTO and similar entities when it comes, for example, to data regulation, to IPs, to data flows, between jurisdictions, to ensure that, there's consumer privacy, to ensure that there's trade facilitation and innovation at the same time. So balancing all of these three components. And one last thing, when it comes to the green transition,
right,
which is another key pillar, again, we have areas such as carbon pricing, for example, that organizations such as the WTO entities and businesses look up to, to provide guidance, to provide regulation when it comes to, how will you deal with carbon pricing, and because that will dictate carbon trading platforms, what and who do you actually trade with moving forward, and also push to markets and businesses to adopt more environmental friendly and push to more environmental friendly producers at the same time. So,
and also, I guess, balancing the costs of it, right? Whether it's the carbon border adjustment mechanism and the global south getting hurt more than, say, the developed world or Europe. Rula, in the context of these shifting supply chains and new bilateral trade agreements, where are you seeing the opportunities for big companies to step in, and how are they dealing with it? How are they doing business differently in this environment?
I think it was mentioned a bit earlier, that just in time versus just in case. So we clearly see a lot of shift on that angle. Doesn't necessarily mean all the time that companies are stocking on inventory as we speak now, but they're building on multiple relationships with multiple suppliers. So that just in case, just in case, sorry, takes place more from a backup perspective. So clearly there's a need to relook into the whole supply chains. Every company more or less is doing that. With my exposure specifically on this region, as I mentioned, everyone is trying to really leverage and capitalize on the geographical location of the region, in addition to all the growth and the potential and the diversification that is taking place. So we see a lot of companies setting facilities, especially in Saudi and UAE, manufacturing facilities, when I say facilities, and rethinking their supply chain on how to make sure that they have the strong relationship on the back of everything they do with the suppliers, with the multiple jurisdiction countries from where they're going to be importing, which I would say wasn't necessarily the case in the past, right? It wasn't really a thought of. It's more like a learning curve after all what happened, whether it's COVID-19, whether it's Russia, Ukraine fallout, which clearly sent a big shock on energy prices across the globe, where we see mostly European companies struggling, where inflation went up by around 2% at that time. And it was a learning process for everyone. So we do see it. It's still a bit more theoretical, but it is happening gradually. I personally think that era after the 1945 has definitely came to an end. We should just embrace that it's a new time, it's a new processes when it comes to deglobalization or fragmentation, and clients are aware and conscious that this is how they need to look at it.
Just, I think I just looked at the clock and I can't believe we only have just under 2 minutes left. So I kind of want to start wrapping it up. But one of the questions that often emerges is, in the state of flux that global supply chains and global trade are in, that companies are in, where do kind of regulators, policymakers, multilaterals, businesses, how do you set up the guardrails? In the Middle East, for example, especially here, there is so much activity. It's not only just goods trade, but there's digital and services. So how are you thinking about it at the DMCC, Faryal?
So dialogue is key. And one of the most important recommendations that we keep giving businesses, and we've highlighted it also in our Future of Trade report, is to continue dialogue between businesses and governments or authorities who actually put down these regulations and laws. I mean, the landscape is so dynamic right now. I mean, it's changing day by day, from geopolitics, from macroeconomics. It's just so difficult to accurately predict what's down the line, as long as businesses continuously reevaluate their supply chains. They have mitigation plans in place, resilient plans and alternatives in place. That's what you can do, basically, up until. And we are very lucky in the UAE to have a government that listens and supports, and it's accessible to businesses to enable trade.
Joanna, did you want to add to that? I think you laid out very well what the WTO has been doing and how it's been dealing with the current period of change. But would you like?
No, we see this period continuing. We see that countries' governments are taking more and more unilateral measures in response to many of the geopolitical and economic and security issues. And at the same time, we see the importance of that dialogue continuing between not only private sector and government, but also among governments, and in the sense of asking the question, okay, where can the international trading system support a lot of the objectives that countries have, which are common? They want to all respond to the global challenges. Everybody's working and agrees on the importance of the green transition. The question is, how do we use the rules and the institutions that we have built over the last decades to support this transition and try to minimize the frictions that we see?
And I assume that would include, changing the rules as well, and the rules of the game start getting altered.
As necessary, yes, taking a look at some of the agreements and seeing if some of them need to be updated for the modern economy, as well as trying to address some of the newer issues. We're just opening an office within the Secretariat for frontier technologies and trade. How is trade going to affect the deployment of frontier technologies? And how are frontier technologies like AI going to affect trade? Comparative advantage. Big changes are coming and we're hoping to be ready for them.
Before we wrap up, Beth, I want to give you an opportunity here to step in.
One of the things we've tried to do is make sure that we're very thoughtful about how we sort out where we're going to go. And one of the things we did earlier this year was put out a request for information to the public about supply chains. We targeted a few sectors so that we could get some responses that were tailored, but that's part of it. It's moving away from an ideology of free trade and more towards a pragmatic approach that lets us solve for the very real problems that were exposed by the pandemic.
Well, thank you so much. It's been an absolutely excellent discussion. I think we'll have to conclude our panel. I do have a few more questions, but I think I'm going to have to stop. So thank you so much. I think, it's a fascinating time just to hear from all of you because so much is changing. And I think as people navigate it, it's increasingly challenging, but I guess everyone's looking for opportunities now. So thank you.
Thank you, Anja.